More than 500 CEOs and business leaders are demanding senators increase gun safety in the U.S. Everytown for Gun Safety said today 515 major companies and leaders signed a letter urging Congress to pass new measures to prevent gun violence. This includes Yelp, Yahoo, Lyft, and several professional sports teams.
This comes as bipartisan negotiations over a gun reform bill have reached a stalemate. Democratic and Republican senators are struggling to finalize details of the framework for a gun reform compromise. The lawmakers are seeking to vote on the bill next week ahead of a July 4th recess. Well, joining us now for more information on this is CBS political correspondent Caitlin Huey-Burns. And Caitlin, so glad you could join us. How significant is this letter demanding gun safety? And do you think it could really have an impact on Capitol Hill?
Hey, Michelle. Well, this is a significant letter because it does represent the broad, at times bipartisan opinion that there should be something done to address the nation's gun laws. We see in our own polling that there is bipartisan broad support for things like background checks and other measures. But the question about whether this will actually move the people that need to be moved in order to actually get legislation passed through Congress is another story. And what's interesting to see over the past several months, especially, we've seen that Republicans who used to be swayed by the business community, and kind of moved by businesses saying, look, we are not going to do business if you don't do this, they've really disregarded that. I mean, remember in Florida, Ron DeSantis went toe-to-toe with Disney. So it hasn't really been something that will drive the votes needed, and that's what they need, are Republican votes. So while this does represent kind of the broad opinion out there that something should be done, I don't think something like this is going to necessarily move lawmakers it needs to, who are much more swayed by the right flank of their party.
And Caitlin, I know you've reported on how time for these lawmakers is really of the essence. They had hoped to hold a vote in Congress by next week on that gun reform bill. It appears to be less and less likely that's going to happen. So what's standing in the way of a compromise?
Yeah, Elaine, we started the week reporting that there was this big bipartisan breakthrough on a framework regarding gun legislation. But it's always the case that a framework is very different, as you know, from actual legislative text. So lawmakers on both sides who have been negotiating these details have been trying to translate principles into actual legislation. And there have been some key sticking points that have emerged. And chief among them, the big hang-up still, as we are talking on this Friday, is this so-called boyfriend loophole. Now, you may remember this being talked about in previous gun negotiations. It was something that was brought up frequently in the Violence Against Women Act and never had the support that they needed from Republicans. And basically what it does is, look, there are laws on the books already that say if you're a domestic abuser, you cannot get, if you're a convicted domestic abuser, you cannot get access to a firearm, but it's limited. If you, it only applies if you are a spouse, a parent, shared a parent, or if you are a live-in partner. And what Democrats have been trying to do is expand the definition of the relationship between a domestic abuser, and that's where Republicans are very resistant to changing that language to make it broader. So I know that sounds like a lot of deep in the weeds details, but this is something that Republicans and Democrats have been really squabbling over the past couple of days as they're trying to get to something. Now, what's significant is John Cornyn, as you remember, who's the Republican lead negotiator on this. He left yesterday's meeting and went back to his home state of Texas. And later today, he's going to be talking to the Texas Republican Party at an event. And so we're going to be watching to see whether, when lawmakers go home, the last recess, they actually heard from constituents that they wanted something done on gun reform. But it will be interesting to see whether he's facing Republican pressure to tamp down, water this down even further.
Caitlin, the number of mass shootings just continues to escalate across the U.S. in recent years. There have been 268 mass shootings in 2022 alone, and we are just at the halfway mark. How vital is the passage of a gun violence bill to lawmakers and their constituents? Even those who are in the, we talk about the silent majority, there's a vocal minority. But, is there any way to really sort of measure like how the country feels about this in each state, in each district?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting dynamic to watch for, because talking to Republicans on Capitol Hill, they often tell me that any legislation should be done at the state level. And we have seen states react to mass shootings. In Florida, for example, after Parkland, they actually did pass a couple of measures to curb back gun rights. And that was significant because it was a Republican legislature and a Republican governor who signed that into law. But at the federal level, there is a deep resistance among the Republican Party to legislate federally on these issues. I mean, there's even been hang-ups on some of the parameters in this bill. Republicans thinking that there is too much given up for Second Amendment rights. So it's always this really tricky balance. But Chris Murphy, who's the Democrat that has been leading these negotiations, has been trying to argue that even though this bill is not what Democrats have wanted, and not, including a lot of the things they'd advocated for over the years, that something has to give here. And we did see, as Michelle, you and I talked about last weekend, these mass protests across the country. We've seen the pressure continue to build. And last week on Capitol Hill, you heard this devastating testimony from gun violence victims. And it's just a reminder, as you say, this is ongoing.
Yes, an incredibly emotional issue. Caitlin Huey-Burns. Caitlin, thank you.
Thank you.